Okay, everyone, let's talk about Paul Revere's ride. Now, you have had the opportunity, I hope, to watch the two videos that were attached to your assignment, one giving you a more historical approach to the biography of Paul Revere, and the other one a more interesting fact approach to Paul Revere and about the poem itself. So, as you know, this poem was not actually written during Paul Revere's lifetime. This poem was written in 1860, and Wadsworth Longfellow was a Union supporter prior to the Civil War. And the thing is that he did not want the Civil War to come. So he decided to write this narrative poem, remember, narrative telling a story, to embrace the sense of patriotism that the country had during the Revolution. The main thing is that when he was writing this poem, he saw how divided our country was in 1860, right before the Civil War. So he just thought, maybe if I show everyone how we were once united and reignite that sense of patriotism, maybe I can slow down this thing before it comes to war. Well, as you know, it didn't work, but we have a great story, even though it's not historically accurate, and a great narrative poem that brings together both the ideas of storytelling as well as poetry. Now, on my website, I do have a fully marked up version of that, but I just wanted to kind of go through this with you. So we start off up here where we bring in the exposition. Now remember, when we talk about exposition, that's the introduction to the story, characters, setting, and conflict. So listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Guys, this is 1775. Remember, we got our revolution and our 4th of July celebration in 1776. So this is happening right before the revolution gets started. So here we have introducing this. We have our character, Paul Revere. We have our setting, 18th of April, 1775. And so when we get down to this next stanza, you begin to see what the conflict is. Now, he said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. All right, so here we get a little bit more about setting. North Church, that lets us know it's Boston, all right? And so we also have Middlesex Village and Farm. Now, it's not what you think it is. This is actually the name of their county. Guys, these people had not really been relocated from England that long, maybe a little over 100 years for some of the earliest residents. They didn't come up with a whole bunch of original names. I mean, think about it. We have New York. Guess what's in England? York. We have New Hampshire. Guess what's in England? Hampshire. So Middlesex is actually the name of a county in England. So that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the countryside. So here is the other part of the conflict. So he's saying if the British march, all right, then we're going to get our country folk to be up and to arm, to be ready to fight back. That's the conflict of this story. Now, one of the things that they don't do is they don't tell you a whole lot about his friend. Now, the friend he is mentioning here, his name is Robert Newman, and he was the sexton of the Old North Church. Now, the sexton, like for today's standards, would sort of be like the maintenance guy. He was the one who was in charge of basically the church itself. He made sure it was locked up. He made sure that candles were lit. Candles were, burned out. He was the one who would ring the bells. That's what the belfry arch is the bell tower. He's the guy that, would just make sure that everything was functioning for the church as a building. The reason this is important, and this is so great about Paul Revere, at this point, Boston was under lockdown because the British soldiers knew that some stuff was going on and that the Patriots were kind of rousing the people. So they were under curfew. Well, you couldn't go out. You couldn't walk around. And the sexton of the North Church, guess what? He could just say, hey, I'm just going to check on the church. He's supposed to be there. Probably had like a cot or something even in the church. So the fact that Robert Newman, who's not named because they don't want to take away from Paul Revere here as the focal character. But the thing is that Robert Newman, had he been stopped and questioned on his way, nobody would have thought anything about it. And so it was a great cover and great for somebody to actually be there to support the Patriot movement. So that's the thing. Paul Revere gets Robert Newman all set up, says, this is what I need you to do. So then this is Paul Revere. He goes down and he actually rows across the harbor. All right. He silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset British man of war. So here we have this description. Now, as I said, the city of Boston was pretty much on lockdown. At this point, we'd had the Boston Tea Party. We'd had all this other stuff going on. So, I mean, if you're going to intimidate a group of people, what you do is you bring your biggest warships right into the harbor and just kind of anchor them so that the cannons are all facing the city. So that was part of what Paul Revere had to do. He had to get past this warship. Now, of course, it's nighttime. There's no electricity, so there's no lights, nothing but the moon. But he's got to get past this very quietly, because if any of those soldiers on board that ship see him, they're going to shoot him. So again, here's part of that excitement that's building up, is how dangerous this was. And even look at this simile, where the mast and spar cross the moon like a prison bar. That directly can relate to the people of Boston. They felt like prisoners in their own city because they couldn't leave. So this is what's going on with Paul Revere. He is riding across Boston Harbor to get to Charlestown. Now, we go back here with the action of Robert Newman. He is scoping out, trying to spy and see what's going on with these soldiers. So meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door. So he gets down to where the soldiers are actually staying, and he hears them, the sound of arms, as in guns, and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers. The grenadiers are the foot soldiers, and they're marching down to their boats on the shore. This is what he was looking for. He needed some proof that they were going to move tonight. So here we have, again, some of your poetry elements. Wanders and watches is your alliteration. But remember, eager ears, that's assonance, because it's the vowel sound at the beginning, or at least the same vowel sound within the words, not just the consonant sound that you have with the alliteration. So as our story develops still, here we have all the rising action where Robert Newman is actually getting to where he needs to be. So he goes back to the North Church. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the sombre rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. Now, so he's climbing up into the bell tower. Couple of things just to point out. Again, we have the somber rafters. Somber meaning very serious. So we're looking at personification here. Again, we have more alliteration. And as a reminder, alliteration is a sound device, and it is used to help propel the action of the poem forward. So you have all of this rhyme, which, I mean, you know at this point, all the different, types of end rhyme that you can see. But this plus the alliteration and the rhythm of this poem are what's propelling the action of what's happening. So he gets up to the top and he just stops to look around and look, and the moonlight flowing over all. So you have a little bit of hyperbole here. Remember that exaggeration. The moonlight's flowing, not just shining down. All right. Getting a little bit further, this is actually one of my favorite stanzas out of this poem. He's sitting up in the belfry tower and he's looking, and this is what he sees. Now remember, this is a time period where most of the churches had that graveyard right next to where the church was. So beneath in the churchyard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, all is well. I absolutely love this phrasing and this imagery. Guys, you're looking at a time period where they're just waiting on war to happen. That's what they're doing. They're getting ready, because here these soldiers are getting ready to go into the countryside. And so the images and the thoughts that are going through the people's mind have to do with battle. So he's looking at this graveyard and he sees the white tombstones, because this is the old times where you had the little white tombstones all lined up. And he sees them as though you're looking at a war camp. He's talking about their night encampment, the sentinel's tread. That's the guy who walks through camp and it's like 1 a.m. and all is well. Look what he describes with the watchful night wind. You've got that personification. Creeping along from tent to tent, you've got that alliteration. Tent to tent, those are the gravestones, and seeming to whisper, all is well. So the imagery here is projected through the idea of battle. Like this is a camp that's set up right before a battle begins. And so he kind of snaps out of it. But look what he says. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. So you, again, have this personification, the lonely belfry, and you have sort of, you could even say a little bit of foreshadowing. But he looks out and he sees that the boats are actually crossing Boston Harbor. So that's where we leave Robert Newman, up in the belfry tower, waiting to give his signal. All right. So here what we have is we have a shift in the poem, because at this point we are shifting completely over to Paul Revere and what he is doing. Now, he's on the other side, and look at all of this imagery that they provide. He's impatient. He's ready to go. He pats his horse's side. He gazes around. He stamps the earth. He checks the saddle on his horse. He's watching the North Church Tower. And look what it says, the belfry tower of the Old North Church as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. Again, you have that imagery, you have the alliteration, and you even have the personification. It's lonely, it's spectral, meaning ghostly, it's somber, it's very serious. This is a very important time. And then he sees it. So he gets on the saddle, and before he rides off, he waits, and he sees a second lamp. And he knows that they're coming by sea. All right, so Paul Revere takes off. And again, we have some description. This is probably my second favorite stanza, where he goes through a hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark struck out by that steed flying fearless and fleet. That was all. And yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. Now, again, we know that this is exaggerated based on what happened in the real story, but look at what he describes and why this would bring an idea of patriotism to these people who were reading it, that this one man writing to warn the countryside, the whole fate of the nation is on his shoulders. And then you have like a spark struck out, like a spark meaning literal because the horse's hooves are hitting the rocks, but we're also talking figurative here, because that's all it takes, one person and then another person catching on to that person's energy, and that's what they needed. They needed the countryside to rise up. And that's what he says, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. They're getting ready. They are definitely going to rise up as a nation, as colonists, and fight against the British. And so this just describes him riding from that location at Boston Harbor to get out to the people. All right, so I'm going to pause the recording here because I think I only get 15 minutes, and I'm going to come back in just a second and do a second one where we get to the end and kind of talk about the rest of it.